All right, I'll get going. My name is Gene Guidry, and I'm an architect with Chaplin Peer Architects here in New Orleans. I am co-chair of the ULI Louisiana Programs Committee, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion on land use inequity in Southern Louisiana. Urban Land Institute is an international multidisciplinary nonprofit organization that provides leadership in responsible land use, helping to create and sustain thriving communities. We would like to thank all of our annual sponsors and members. If you enjoy the content or are interested in learning more, please visit our website and become a member at uli.org. Our next event is the final installment in our Reading the Color of Law on September 15th, facilitated by Christopher Tyson, who is also one of this event's panelists. You'll be introduced to a little bit later. A couple housekeeping items before continuing. During the presentation, we ask that all questions be submitted through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom, and please upvote those questions you'd be interested in hearing more about. At the end of the discussion, depending on time, the panelists will address the most popular questions in a live Q&A session. ULI Louisiana, in partnership with ULI Triangle, are currently engaged in a group reading of Richard Rothstein's influential work, The Color of Law. Mr. Rothstein spotlights a continuous thread of federal land use policies over the decades that overtly and often blatantly subjugate minority communities to an even lower caste. Today's panel discussion will cast light on some of these inequities right here in our backyard. We're lucky to have these distinguished thought leader panelists here with us today, who you will hear conversate on the struggle with an eye on best practices for positive change. I'm honored to introduce Nairi Ramsey, Executive Director of UJAMA Economic Development Corporation. UJAMA was organized with the mission of equitable redevelopment of the Claiborne Corridor and adjacent communities, with a commitment by the organization's leadership to cultural preservation, economic opportunity, housing affordability, environmental sustainability, and safe and healthy neighborhoods for the Claiborne Corridor communities. Nairi, along with Asali Ecclesiastes, whom Nairi will introduce shortly, has curated this panel and its content. Nairi, thanks again for making this event possible. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. You unmuted me. Thank you, Dean. UJAMA is honored to help produce tonight's event. You all know this is a very timely conversation, especially as we talk about land use and inequity with the backdrop of our national presidents campaigning, with the backdrop now of Hurricane Katrina's 15th anniversary. So I thank all of our participants for making time for this conversation. The panelists assembled tonight are dynamic, innovative, and just really all wonderful people to work with because of their very strong commitment to this cause. And I know that they're going to get us into trouble, you know, as we talk about some of our legislative flaws, but certainly what are the opportunities for us as we think about the color of law. Our moderator for this evening is none other than the incomparable Asali Ecclesiastes, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for almost 25 years. I won't say my age, but you all saw Asali's bio on the presentation about when you signed up for this event, but you know that she is an artist and an activist, right? And so she has been in this work for her whole life. Some people in the Claiborne Corridor refer to her as Harriet Tubman. I won't name names, but we do thank her for that spirit and that energy in this time. Asali really helped her solidify the Claiborne Corridor work and institute it as part of the city government. As part of the initiative for city government. So this Cultural Innovation District is, of course, now a public and private partnership with the city. You all actually heard her speak at the last ULI conference last year. And so, again, we thank you for inviting her to join us tonight. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer at Ashe Cultural Arts Center. And I will just say that these are very large and wonderful bios for everybody, but I'm going to keep it short because we want to get to the meat of the conversation. Next, I'll introduce Mr. Chris Tyson. So Mr. Tyson, you all know because he is, of course, your ULI Triangle Book Club facilitator for the Color of Law. He serves as President and Chief Executive Officer at Build Baton Rouge, which is leading wonderful and dynamic innovations in Baton Rouge. And his claim to fame is leveraging over 80 million to create 100 million in projects and affordable housing. Did Fred join us yet? No. Okay. I'll move on to another leader, Ms. Lynetta Gilbert. The community was very instrumental in how New Orleans was able to rebuild itself after Katrina. So Ms. Gilbert, kudos to you, certainly, as we think about what you've contributed over those many years, as we're looking at now, year 15. She has been, in philanthropy for a great large part of her career, and now she's actually running her own private practice as she coaches nonprofits and foundations and does strategic development planning with them. She sits on the board of the Old Algiers Main Street Corporation and was the founding member and past chairwoman for the Foundation for Louisiana. Dejan Jordan is my colleague, so I'm going to go to him next. At Ujima, Dejan is a graduate from LSU with a bachelor's in architect and received his master's in city planning from MIT. He is a native New Orleans who serves Ujima as our Director of Strategy and Real Estate Development. He also worked deeply with place-based economic development programs here in the US, South Africa, and Mexico. He specializes in commercial district rehabilitation and revitalization efforts, having worked with our Broad Street Development Program and also Bayou Road. Finally, we do have two participants joining us from New Orleans Business Alliance, and I thank you all for being here with us. You all know that the New Orleans Business Alliance has as its mission region focusing primarily on businesses of color. And so we thank them for that commitment to that particular targeted group. Ms. Colin White is the Vice President of Small Business Growth at NOLA BA. And prior to that, she directed the Women's Business Center at the Urban League of Louisiana. She serves on the board of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority and the East New Orleans Business Development District. And last but not least, my friend Greg Lawson, who also is a native New Orleanian and community engagement guru. Greg makes sure that we all get a seat at the decision-making table. He helped to institute the neighborhood participation policy, which he both authored and implemented under former Mayor Mitch Landrieu, and then championed again to make sure that it was throughout all of the city departments under our current mayor, Mayor Latoya Cantrell. So thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Asali Devon Ecclesiastes, please take it away.
There I am. Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited about this conversation, and I'm just going to warn you from the beginning. I gave strict instructions for my children to stay away for the next hour or so, but you know, we just never know what might happen. So welcome to all of you, and it's a great welcome because not only are we, you know, partners in this conversation, but it's great to see so many partners in this work, particularly when we are talking about the kinds of changes that we're looking to make in regards to this conversation about the color of law. So I'm very excited about the conversation because of all of the different perspectives. And I want to start with Miss Lynetta Gilbert, if she doesn't mind, to give us a kind of a global understanding, a global view in your experience. You have seen the kinds of policies that are discussed in the color of law and how they have been implemented, how outcomes have been impacted for communities of color around the world. And was just wondering if you could kind of add you know, a little commentary about that perspective and how you see this United States issue being amplified in other places. You have to unmute.
Thank you. This is an exciting time. for me, for the world, and I'm happy that we're talking about land use. I worked for several years with the Ford Foundation, and I had a global portfolio that looked at community-based giving. And I was embedded in a department that focused on community development. So I did have a chance to travel primarily in the global South most often, but I did get to Europe and other places. Land is, of course, a big issue wherever we go. And it is a way, it has always been a way since early centuries of distinguishing power and access. And it has continued in the New World as America was discovered. That was ground level requirement. Let's be certain that you'd have to have land in order to have voice in America. I would say currently in the global South, there are still struggles. In some countries on the continent, it's tribal struggles continue about land ownership. And again, it's around power. And of course, the economy gets connected with that. We see that very often, even now in some of the communities, Angola, Congo, those are places where, and even the western coast of Africa, still under contention about who's going to make decisions, and the decision-making power is based on land ownership. South America, less so around the land and more so around the economy and education. South America has done a great job of keeping South and Central America dividing classes by who gets educated. And so those things just continue. You'll see the same thing in Asia. In New Orleans, we are a composite of many different cultures. And so with the founding of New Orleans as a city, we kind of made sure those who came first had designs on what it should look like. And it was really focused mostly on the East Bank development, and then later on the West Bank development. So I would say to you that whether they were Northern Europeans who came or Southern Europeans, Spanish, French, the modality of operating was what they knew in their country, and that's what got transplanted here. And again, class, race and class, and economic access through land ownership were critical factors.
So, thank you absolutely for that. So in the American context, with this race and class, and so, seeing that there's a, kind of a larger way, a different way that it's expressed in different countries when it comes to this American context, and how race and class were implemented in the law, when faced at the same time with this American ideal of, of freedom, of, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, of equality, and those kinds of things. Dejan, I would be interested to hear in your in both your schooling around urban planning and education, and both in how you saw it implemented actually in communities. How does America manage to get away with creating laws that are opposite to its stated mission?
I would say the way planning history is told is that it's invisible and hypervisible at the same time. The legacy of this country really has to do, again, with what Ms. Lynetta said about the land owning aspiration. So can we tell the story of your sense of self-determination and your right to a place first? And then can we secretly codify our words and our value through storytelling to mean different things? Within planning, we don't tell the history of oppression, and we don't tell the history of activists. And it kind of goes to the African proverb that, the hunter will always be the victor as long as the lion can't, is not allowed to tell his own story. And so at that point, thinking about the color of law and the story of perpetual federal regulation and oppression, when the government owns the narrative and people and actors within the government and are cooperatively complicit in telling a larger story about who has the right to self-determination, who are people, whether they're 3/5 of a person or not. Those are some of the ways in which the idea eventually that we know as the American dream becomes the impetus for how we even look at cities, how we look at development, and how we think about people of color, explicitly Black people, and the most marginalized of those, low-income Black folks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, with that being said, not my phone, not my phone. Okay. With that being said, one of the things that I enjoy about the color of law isn't it doesn't just go into how law, affected, it goes into the red line and in that history, but also, like the state sanctioned violence and, all of those things, around, how the law was able to do all of those things, right? And how they tied them to one another. And I saw Greg nodding, so I'm going to call him into the conversation to talk about how you see some of those outcomes on the ground in community where you are, and how is it that you are able to, when you are experiencing, right? How is it that you're able to help neighborhoods understand what they're experiencing under the law and articulate their own solutions to those issues?
I think this is an important conversation. So, based on from my experience, I came from working in the mayor's office, and so right after Katrina, I started organizing people, and so understanding policy wasn't my understanding. I wanted people back in their homes after Katrina, particularly my family. So I got started off, but I understood that housing policy. So I started off with looking at Road Home as an example of how it was structured. But my grandparents live in the HDLC, which is Historic District Landmark Commission neighborhood. And I watched how her neighbors use city policy to kind of displace African Americans in the neighborhood. And how that looked is HDLC has strict guidelines and regiments of how you uphold a historic home. Typically, African Americans necessarily didn't know they lived in HDLC districts in the city. And so they would find out once they got a find. And so I saw that particularly in the Irish Channel neighborhood right after Katrina, as people look to kind of go to higher ground, which is closer to the river, that how they use city policies to perpetuate that, which led me to get into the city government and crafting NPP policy, which is basically using community wisdom and government expertise and combining that to really develop neighborhoods. Because what I did see was that community members who were advocating on the front lines to get back in the house post Katrina didn't have a seat at the table as folk were developing neighborhoods. And so I looked at the HGSC policies, but looked at the reality that there was an opportunity for residents to understand what that necessarily meant for them. And so I watched a whole bunch of people in Irish Channel, particularly about 30 Black-owned families who've been there for 50 plus years, be moved to a city policy that I don't think was necessarily designed that way, but based on federal policies and state policy that led to that, that was created. And so that's been my experience.
What was that particular policy? Do you recall?
It's part of the HDLC policies about strict guidelines on maintaining historic homes in the city. And we all love our historic and preservation. I'm a preservation. I live in a remodeled historic home, but I also believe that when people didn't have the access to capital to remodel, because when you think about it, to put a historic shutter inside your house, Miss Lynetta lives in Old Algiers, it's quite expensive. And so when families don't have that access to dollars to do that, people use policy to then use city policy. So people had fines, and so you can pay those fines off. Then you can buy the house off tax sale for little or nothing, and somebody is displaced. And so typically we work with residents to understand what policy and how it affected them, and then help them advocate and develop plans to kind of be at the table with government around how they use these same policies to make sure that people are in their homes.
So with that being said, one of the things you mentioned is that you don't think that the law was made with the intention, of the result, right, of that particular outcome, to move those 30 Black folks out of the Irish Channel. But since then, it's been used many, many times to move lots of Black people out of lots of neighborhoods around New Orleans, right? So when we begin to look at something like that, so Chris, I want to draw you into the conversation because you are actually working on and building affordable housing in a community that is at risk of, you know, of the same kind of displacement these neighborhoods are facing. And in that work, have you been able to identify policies that are threatening your residents?
All right. I don't know if I thought someone else was going to unmute me. So good to be here, and thank you, Sally, for the question. So I think what, you know, Baton Rouge is a different environment to be so close in Louisiana from New Orleans. We're kind of worlds away when it comes to the culture around affordable housing. While, you know, New Orleans has, you know, specifically these regulatory devices that people can manipulate and kind of deploy for their own uses, usually without full knowledge by communities. And by the time they do get the knowledge, it's too late. The challenges for Baton Rouge is a wholesale lack of regulation, right? In which case kind of market principles are kind of reigning. So you don't have effective code enforcement. You don't have any affordable housing policy. You don't have really robust neighborhood level organizations that are funded beyond volunteer efforts that can really you know, use have the capacity and deploy the resources to safeguard people's interests and make sure that neighborhoods are protected and developed in equitable ways that prioritize the people and businesses that exist there presently. And, you know, in the absence of that, right, it's, you know, you're trying to construct a set of policies that will advance an equitable agenda that will protect people, that will also make sure that resources are allocated equitably and fairly. And you know, that's a separate issue, right? It's a separate challenge because in the absence of that, it's easy for, frankly, money and private interests to kind of reign, particularly when, and this is also a problem with Baton Rouge, is that many of our poorest Black neighborhoods kind of suffer marginalization by invisibility, which means that it's possible to live your entire life in Baton Rouge and not go into certain parts of North Baton Rouge. So you have a kind of isolated, you know, islands of just non-recognition, right? And so capital doesn't go there, concern doesn't go there, and they're not thought of as the city that we're trying to develop or improve or do anything in, because they're outside of how we've conceived of the urban community. So that, you know, is kind of layered on top of an inadequate policy regime that would give you the tools and direct the resource flow to protect those neighborhoods from exploitation, but also ensure, right, that it's not just a defensive tactic, but that it is proactively channeling resources to develop in ways that prioritize the people that live there. So Build Baton Rouge in the last, you know, few years of rebuilding ourselves has done so with a focus on equitable development and trying to stand in the gaps of this lack of policy and this kind of marginalization by invisibility to turn the city's focus to its most challenged neighborhoods that have frankly been written off as you know, incapable of being addressed, and then kind of deploy you know, an equitable driven focus of urban and neighborhood transformation to those neighborhoods. So I'll stop there, but I think that, you know, we have situations where these policies have long been, and I think that's the benefit of the color of law, right? Is that we get to understand the policy lineage, which is so important. And I always emphasize that because for many people, if you go through particularly poor Black and brown neighborhoods, given the existing zeitgeist of the nation, right, you are driven to deduce that you are witnessing the cumulative mass results of people who made poor choices, or people who are biologically or culturally predisposed to not care about their communities, or people who aren't worthy of the full benefits of citizenship and the redistribution of the community's resources towards their benefit, right? And absent, an alternative narrative that is rooted in history, rooted in this particular policy and legal and social and economic lineage, that kind of empowers you to understand that there is absolutely no urban crisis, right? What we are seeing is the logical result, right? Is what we should expect given the history that we can chart, right? That we can list out, that we can identify.
It's a product of the design. It's a direct product.
Yeah, that it's not a crisis at all. It is the intended.
It's a crisis for some people.
Well, yes, indeed. It's certainly a crisis for the people.
It's a daily crisis for some people.
But
that sets up exactly what I wanted to speak to Lynette about, because one of the other issues that's brought up in the Color of Law is the wage suppression, or and we see it. When I think about the work in the Claiborne corridor, the part that's like really like emotional for me is the stripping of intergenerational wealth. Like, you see the result of the laws, the result of the policies, and as a, like, I'm in the middle, right? I'm 46. So like, I remember, some of the, how the neighborhood was before the interstate, like, or when the early impacts, were happening. And then I look at the results of the neighborhood now, and I still live in the neighborhood I grew up in, and I'm still raising my children there, and when we started embarking on this work, a lot of the resistance that we got was around, well, those neighborhoods are not worthy of investment, or not understanding equitable development and thinking that, okay, if we're concentrating investment here, then we're taking it from somewhere else, but never acknowledging that, okay, well, when we focused on Magazine Street, we didn't call it investment in white businesses, right? But that's just what we did. And they got below market rate money and all of the subsidy that we wouldn't even think or dream of giving to a Black commercial corridor, at this time. When we talk about Black folks, they need capacity built in, right? They don't need money. White folks just need money. We just need capacity. So how do you tackle that, Lynette, in the work that you do? Lynette's on mute. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And so often, you get neighborhoods that get labeled low income, and that, turns to equal, not worthy of investment. Yeah, and neighborhoods like the Claiborne corridor, neighborhoods like Aretha Castle Haley Boulevard, when there was a time when that was a vibrant neighborhood, and it was a vibrant neighborhood for Black people, where we had Black shop owners. And then as white people wanted something different, those neighborhoods started to change, and it's part of, what we're also seeing in other places like New Orleans East, where after Katrina, it was very intentional that, they were migrating people who they did not want in the city, right? And then as gentrification started and got worse, people wanting to come back to the city who weren't there, there are some, very strategic neighborhoods, older neighborhoods where land values are much more affluent, much more expensive, but there are still people of color living in those neighborhoods. And we saw where developers now go to those neighborhoods and offer money, certainly not enough money for those homes. And then they end up getting people out of their homes, redeveloping these neighborhoods. And now the people who live there are being displaced and cannot afford to be in their own neighborhoods. And then that means now let's push people out to specific areas where we can keep these low-income people in one specific area. And now we start to build up, these other better neighborhoods with other people who want to live here and who can afford to live there. So, they are literally moving us out of our neighborhoods, right? But you're right, as we're talking about wages for those neighborhoods, as we see, out in New Orleans East, where when neighborhoods are, void of commercial services, commercial resources, that usually means property values diminish, right? So where you had, affluent folks, families that lived in New Orleans East, property values are consistently diminishing, right? And they are continuously moving people who they don't want in the city, to the outskirts, right? Until the city is going to look completely different. So, I mean, these are policies that we definitely have to overcome. And I think a lot of it, is around educating people about, their property ownership and not being tricked out of selling your properties to somebody for a sinister reason. We also have to look at how these appraisers are appraising our properties, right? You have homes that are consistent in New Orleans East that are consistent to what they are in Lakeview, and they're less than half the value of those properties, right? They're not even using the same types of comps, so, I mean, they're not even doing what they're supposed to do in valuing homes. And so now you're getting people whose homes are completely devalued when they really shouldn't be. And whole communities now are being devalued in that way, right? And I think, it's policies and systems that we have to call out, right? There are not a lot of Black appraisers. And so the white appraisers who come to Black neighborhoods tend to severely devalue the properties in our communities. And then as we're not able to, we get brokers who are not interested, redlining, in areas where they are not interested in building up commercial resources and retail in those communities, then you continuously see, property values diminishing in those communities.
And Lynette, that reminds me of a couple of things. One is Andre Perry's new book, Know Your Price.
Know Your Worth.
Also something that interested parties should take a look at, and deal specifically with the issue of appraisers and that whole system. And I'm reminded of Senate hearing, of appraisers when they were responding that they didn't see any reason why, just because they were all white, that would result in any kind of inequity in the appraising profession. So that was interesting. And then also, remember when we learned in doing our work at NOLA BA that in the city that real estate agents were literally telling folks who wanted to buy in the East and to develop in it, particularly businesses and commercial property, no, you don't want to build there. You don't want to develop
there.
there.
Redlining is still there. Redlining is still there. And the red line seems to be the industrial canal. We don't go to that side.
Mm-hmm. So, in practice, even, redlining is still there in lots and lots of ways. And I think that identifying, the practices outside of the policies is one of the ways that, impact can be made and felt in that area. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say, not just identify and call them out. We got to call out these, these racist policies and these racist practices.
Right. And who do we hold accountable for them? Because I know that here in, we have a special kind of situation where we have local folks, who have certain goals and, development, missions, but that gets fought at the state level, right? Can someone speak to the specific issues we have with moving housing policy in New Orleans? Fred is not on the phone. That's that was our Fred.
I'll speak to it in my other capacity as a law professor at LSU.
Thank you.
Teaching state and local government law. One of the ways that we've seen around the country of addressing the development and advancement of progressive policy at the local level. And usually your urban areas are more progressive than your rural areas is through statewide preemption, right? Where the state will swoop in and say this particular area law is a matter of statewide concern, and therefore we should have the ability to overrule or preempt any local action from being taken. And that's very, we should be concerned about that in the housing context, because housing markets are different, right? In Louisiana, New Orleans' housing market is different from Baton Rouge, Shreveport, Lake Charles, whatever. Now, in all of those areas, we find the marginalization of Black and brown poor communities. We find the maldistribution of resources. So we know those things are constant, but how they show up and manifest themselves are different in each market. And so New Orleans obviously has a pressing and urgent affordable housing issue that it has tried to address at the local level. And you've had attempts at the state level to preempt not just the ability of New Orleans to address its affordable housing issue through appropriate, locally sourced regulation, but across the entire state, to remove the entire matter to an issue of statewide concern where your politics at the State House are different than your politics in the New Orleans City Council or the Baton Rouge City Council or the Shreveport City Council. And that is something that we should be concerned about. It's not something unique to Louisiana. It is indeed, we're seeing an increase in statewide preemption around the nation as more conservative legislative majorities attempt to preempt the ability of more progressive local majorities from enacting policy that achieves many of these progressive aims. So,
well, and what is even, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Lynetta.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example of where
Yes.
there wasn't state preemption, but there was full agreement of the state with locals around the building of the Greater New Orleans Mississippi River Bridge and the phase 2 of it. Now remember, the first bridge was because people were trying to travel to the West Bank for work or business. When that first bridge went up, as I understand it, it took by eminent domain properties, some of which had been land grants. Free people of color had received them way back when John McDonough died and freed and left them property. Some of that property was taken for the construction of the bridge, and some of those families were never made whole again. And then 15 years later, when the second span was put up, what the state did was a similar act, but it was because the West Bank had grown so much, and 59% of the people who traveled the bridge lived on the West Bank and went to work on the East Bank. So they were trying to make it easier for access to jobs. But in the same regard, they caused some confusion and disruption of housing patterns. And of course, the biggest hit for, I'll say the West Bank, but it includes all of the West Bank and Algiers, was the building of the Fisher Housing Development, which was placed right in the middle of an African-American community of homeowners without consent. Much complaint before it went up, but there was agreement again that this was what was necessary for the betterment of the economy at the time. And I keep raising that because for many years, there was much more economic activity on the West Bank than on the East Bank. And so whether because of the river traffic and shipping and the freight lines and all of that, business people who would not want to live here, who chose to live uptown, still had to come over here to do business. So, you know, their needs probably superseded what occurred for regular homeowners here. So that's just one example of where, through an agreement of local and parish officials and state officials, people lost homes. And of course, when our economy changed on the West Bank, we were like ghost towns in many regards because, again, there was no ability to work and live near where you work. And then our transportation, which is another huge policy piece, you've got to always consider when you're talking about housing, affordable housing, because too many people have had poor transportation lines, paid too much and took too long to get to work, for them to continue to survive. And when I say to you that many people who live on the West Bank, especially in Old Algiers, are cost burdened, I mean it when I say that they are working. Many of them are working but they're not getting paid enough
Not
to
enough.
pay the rents that have accelerated.
Absolutely.
And of course, Algiers is the last neighborhood really closest to downtown New Orleans for redevelopment, okay? Because we were not impacted directly by Katrina or Rita. So many people came, we were a receiving community. We didn't receive money. We received people who bought houses and stayed here. But the economy was not built up around those individuals. We're still 15 years later trying to do that. So I want to just emphasize that it's affordable housing, housing policy period, because some of it is we're building mansions on top of swamp again without looking at the environmental impact. And then it is also transportation as far as I'm concerned.
I was just going to add to that because Asali, I believe.
Uh-oh, can you hear me?
Something.
Oh, yes, I was, but you
Okay.
can go ahead. I just want to, I'm looking at the time and I know that we'll have questions and, you know, I knew this was going to happen with this panel. Like I mean, how can you contain all of this, you know, to an hour? But go ahead and.
I was just going to say quickly with what Ms. Lynetta was saying about the use of eminent domain
Yes.
Black neighborhoods for the construction of interstates, and that we know that is a national story, right? We know that we developed the national highway system running through cities almost in virtually every place it ran. They ran them through Black neighborhoods, and you can actually trace the paths of many interstates running through cities to find old Black neighborhoods. But part of the issue we know under the Fifth Amendment, right? The government does have the ability to take property for just compensation, and it's the just compensation part that Black.
It's the just compensation part.
We get cheated because we've devalued the property so much that you've decimated any basis for the transfer of wealth in that taking, so that family can then go and purchase property somewhere else.
That is when they are even given compensation in the first place.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I wanted to end us up. Is a phrase that Ms. Lynetta mentioned, was being made whole. So whether it is in compensation for eminent domain, property taken by eminent domain, whether it is in just the intergenerational wealth of businesses being taken away when commercial districts are decimated, whether it's the current displacement that communities are facing, because, all of these things line up perfectly, the transportation burden, the housing burden, the health impacts, all of those things, line up with the laws. Like we can, just like you can trace the direct path of the old Black neighborhoods by the interstates, we can, trace the path of the decline of thriving communities based on these urban renewal laws, et cetera, that communities have been subjected to, as clearly outlined in the text that we're studying. So my question to both this panel and to the larger group of brilliant people who participate in ULI is how do we make these communities whole through the law? And so if everyone on the panel could just, give a thought about that, and then we take the questions. Ms. Lynetta, since you prompted it, we'd love to start with you.
I'm going to let someone else speak for a while.
Okay. How about you, Lynette, since you're right next to her on my screen?
You're going to say that, and I was just kind of thinking too. I mean, it's a hard thing because you've got to, make sure that people recognize the inequities. Too often, we want to gloss over, we want to pretend that we're not seeing the things that, that are really happening. So, and it's really a hard thing when we're talking about money and policies. The government has come out with these opportunity zones, and part of my concern with some of that is that really right for our neighborhoods to give people who have the money, who these, policies make the most sense for? Do they really care about our communities as to what we need, or do they just come here and do something, that makes, sense for them and their profitability? So I just think, you know, we've got to be, you know, just a lot more cognizant of who's making these laws, who are they making them for, and, you know, how they're impacting our communities, and, you know, making sure that we either have a seat at the table, or the people who are representing us, you know, are representing our interest.
That's right. Absolutely. Dejan, I'd love to get your thoughts as the planner on the screen.
I think Lynette, you're right, and we need to be starting with truth. Like, we can look at models across the globe, look at South Africa and the Truth and Peace Reconciliation Commissions. And maybe we don't move to reconciliation because I don't think reconciliation is an inevitability, or that it's the thing that we're going to get. It's not a product, it's a process, and it's being in relationship. And we can't be in relationship if we don't have the same truth. And so you can look in South Africa, you can look in Chile before that, there's lineage there, that if we aren't grounded in the same truth and some of the things that the color of law is bringing, you know, to our table, then we won't come up with the same solutions or the same respect to how we offer repair. We could battle till we're blue in the face about how much money or resources or how reparations get kind of panned out. But the reality is there's this pervasiveness in our country where we don't want to talk about it, because we know if we talk about it, it means we're accountable. And we got to start from a place of accountability. And then from there, we can say, we can push harder on equitable procurement, or land policy that says the people who have been in this place and have been displaced have the right, the first right to the place after. You know, so we can do that, but I think we have to ground it in truth and make sure that everyone, at least at a city level or regional level, is on the same page. And then we can talk about restorative models or transformative models about equitable development.
So Greg, I'm gonna ask you to go next, because you've worked inside of seeing some of the kind of things Dejan and Lynette both spoke of, and trying to move them inside of bureaucracy, moving it through government departments and that kind of thing. So where do you see a solution lying from that perspective?
I think I agree with Dejan about the accountability factor, holding our elected officials and the policymakers accountable. But I also think about kind of looking at anti-displacement policies as investment is happening in what is quote unquote low income neighborhoods, that as cities making investments, right? Because we could talk about Lafitte Greenway investment and how the city made that investment, and how that investment then got private investment and then still pushed out African-American homeowners in that place. But looking at how do you, prior to state, and federal investment, how do we work around anti-displacement policies with our local officials to ensure that folks, as Dejan said, have kind of the first right of refusal, but also making sure that they take part in that investment, right? And so making sure that Black-owned businesses have a say on the commercial quarter versus kind of what I've seen on Ferret. And so me working inside of government, I got to see neighborhoods flip, which is kind of gentrification, but I also says displacement. You know, I don't mind the investment because I've, you know, bought a house and sold it and made money to, you know, help my family in generational, but I also seen folks sell their homes for $18,000 on Lafitte Greenway, and their homes are now $430,000. And I'm often thinking, if we had some type of anti-displacement policies in place before the city made that investment, and I manage the Greenway and I think it's a great investment, but if we had some anti-displacement policies in place prior to that, what would that neighborhood look like? Have we kind of created some generational?
I have to say here, we could have, and we should have, and we knew better at the time, right? We knew, and there were people pushing for it, but we didn't do it. We didn't get it through bureaucracy. So so I want us to be, how do we make that happen? Chris, you working in the government right now? Oh, I'm sorry, the elder has put up her finger. Yes, ma'am.
I want to say that right now, I think we have to expose and depose leaders who are in these, who are not knowledgeable. I'm not going to say that they're willfully. Some of them don't know and understand all of the interconnections of the policies that they're signing. And some of them look like me. Versions of me, same version as me, but they don't know.
I don't know.
So I think some of the organizing that we've done in the past, we've got to come back with that and say, do the whole education and organizing with some of people who are in position. But here's the other thing. You got a whole new group of people. I'm looking at all these flyers up in people I've never seen before in New Orleans are running for some big position. Who are they? You know, when someone said to me a few weeks ago, be careful when you look at the First City Court, that's the court that decides about housing issues, foreclosures. But I didn't know that. So we've got to start making clear what these positions, what power they have, and then we've got to educate them as they are coming into their jobs to let them know we know and here are our expectations. But I also think that we have to, that book really requires us to flip the legislation that occurred in the 40s and 50s on its head.
Yes.
And to really think deeply, carefully about what reparations might mean. You don't have to give all of the Native Americans everything, all the land we're sitting on, but you should start doing it with some of the tribes. You don't have to give the Black community writ large this or that, but you have Black families who we're losing them socially and economically because of some of the things that we're doing. Those are the policies. That's where a city can get in there and say, what is causing the fissure in our communities? And that's what I'm thinking we can do around the land. As I said to you, some of the people in my neighborhood had land given to them. Nobody's ever gone back to them to say, since they put up these bridges and other things, you know, what can we do? And some of those families are 8 generations they've been in this neighborhood. Imagine how I feel talking to them about housing. I think they want to close their doors. So I'm just saying to you, those are the nuances that are affecting what's happening, and we've got to be bold. And I'm going to, the last thing I'll say is the law, the training of lawyers, the preparation of people who go to political science classes and whatever they're called now, the Loyola Institute for Politics, all of those, the curricula has to change. And we have to help be a part of that change. We don't need to sit on board so much anymore. We need to get in there and make some changes. I'm finished. Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Thank you. That's exactly the kind of motivation a change maker like Chris needs. And I'm going to let him round it out for us before we take questions.
I was going to shout when Miss Lynetta was talking about.
You know what I'm saying?
But I want to underscore this point. And it's not to be critical and it's not to condescend anybody. But as Ms. Lynetta has shown, these are not easy issues, right? They're not things that you can just walk into a political office or walk into a bureaucracy and you kind of saw something and you know something about. They are matters of rigorous policy and analysis and sociology, and we should demand people who are engaged in that and who are giving that time so that the solutions that we get are meaningful and make meaningful change. And so I totally agree, Ms. Lynetta, because I see that in Baton Rouge where we just have a lot of educating to do and helping people understand some of the ways, what they're seeing before them, you know, kind of what the antecedents are, what the underlying issues are, and then how to intervene and make change. Another thing I want to flag, and so much of this is comes down to local policy, and we really need to understand local lawmaking and the power of municipal governments to intervene in a lot of this. And I want to stress affordable housing regulation. We view housing as a wealth creating vehicle. And for some of us, and I'll include myself, I own rental property, I own my own home. It's certainly served in that way, and I know people view it as an opportunity for generational wealth. But people need somewhere to live, and housing and communities are where, as the Zillow commercial says, people's lives happen. And so, if our only focus is increasing private wealth, we're going to miss something important about our role as intervening in communities. And the last thing I want to say is that you know, the Color of Law is not just a book of history, right? This is present day stuff. There's no line across which this stuff happened and it's over, and beyond which it's only instructive for us for its historical value. This is an ongoing thing. And so we are having a conversation right now about, still 50 years later, about the enforcement of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The administration, in the twilight of its 2 terms, finally passed an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule with some teeth in it, only to be, gutted.
Right. And I was just going to underscore, Chris, that until it is disrupted, it will always keep going. That's the nature of the law. That's the brilliance of the design, right? Like, this is no way is this history. We're deeply entrenched in this at this moment until we disrupt and turn around the impacts of those laws. So that leads me to Ms. Morgan Aguilar in the Q&A, who asked, where do young people fit into this conversation about controlling owning land? How are young people able to participate in the conversation, as well as the actions towards protecting their communities through land use practices? So this is where we need y'all. We need y'all to be turning these laws on their heads. And I'd like to bring Nairi into the discussion. She just served the wonderful purpose of introducing us, but I'd like her to, talk a little bit about the work that we've done with Ujima and activating young people. And I would love to think of Ujima as a place where young people could find a home to do this kind of work.
Okay, I'm glad to have been put on a spot like that because I'm so young at heart. But I am. I think for us, one of the things that I would love to have us talk a little bit more about, and tonight probably won't be the time, but I know Jean and Nicole talked about us having additional conversations, but this notion of culture and how does culture play a role when we think about land and use and our value to it. As Chris said, your home is where life happens. And guess what? Outside of your home is where life happens as well. And certainly for New Orleans, culture is a very big piece of that. And young people, when we talk about intergenerational practices, are the ones who keep the culture going. So for Ujima, it was important for us to involve young people from the onset. And that's, of course, with the Cultural Innovation District, in terms of having them be involved in not only the planning of what does the activities look like for the CID, but what are some of their aspirations for what can happen in this new transformative space? And so what was exciting to us to hear was that young people want to see us youth city hall, right? So speaking to them, being educated early about what does it mean to be part of this quote unquote bureaucracy, but how do they use it as an advocacy tool? Because they want to be involved so young. And then I think the other piece also, and I'm just give a wonderful shout out to Xavier University, like really this whole notion of how do you have volunteer students who are, excited about their community, excited about being in college, and really having this energy about what they can do to be change agents, and volunteering in our organizations and having firsthand experience of what it means to have something go through the process from an idea to actual policy. And so I would also, mimic Ms. Lynetta's point about bringing people in early, educating people early. So you're not only educating the legislators, but you're educating the people who vote for them, about what their role is and what their responsibility is to you. So I would again, call out rock the vote, all of those practices around us really being honest and articulate about the importance of being involved in the process. You can't talk about it if you're not engaged in it. And you can actually see things move and change. And we have wonderful interns from Xavier University, who are part of our outreach team, who are talking to people on the front line, and getting that firsthand experience so that they can actually see that their outreach became an outcome, based on what the merchants want, based on what the businesses are looking to have happen in the CID. So for me,
we've had support from Dillard. I just want to shout out Dillard and UNO students too, because we've had some.
Dillard and UNO earlier on, yes. We give them all the universities, you did wonderful shout outs. Okay, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, we have a great conglomerate of institutions. But again, I would say for us, it was about engaging people early and letting them see the product of their labor and being very encouraged in it, and encouraged it. And it was also about letting them be part of the planning stages to see their dreams now to become realities as we continue to build it out.
Absolutely. So, Dejan, I see you itching to say something, but I also have a question here. Are you want to say something about this
Yeah, really quick. I just want to say the importance of like paying these young people to do the work, because
Yeah.
we have programs like Job One, we have programs like the Summer Youth Employment Program in Baton Rouge, and they can be geared to be civically minded. But what happens when we make it a mandate that they're working with the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, that they're working with Bill Baton Rouge, that they're working with Sewage and Water Board? Because as they think about and try to solve these pressing issues in the future, if we're integrating knowledge about the history of how we got here, it's inevitable that they'll be the ones to carry the torch. And they know that it's respected work, because most students,
Yeah.
most young people don't even know that they have jobs in the spaces that we're in.
In these spaces, right. And so this, I think, ties in greatly to Jenga's question, because I think it's going to be those kind of people who can actually answer this question that only someone like Jenga could ask. One thing that stuck out to me in the color of law was the participation of tax-exempt institutions in the practice of housing discrimination. What are your thoughts on the responsibility of these institutions, for instance, Tulane University, to one, examine their role in the upholding of white supremacy and benefiting from white supremacy and the disenfranchisement of Black people, and two, to make reparations, to give back some of their ill-gotten gains, and to make whole the communities that their historic actions damaged. Okay, so this is going to be another hour of put on your seatbelts. Here we go. Who wants to tackle that one first? Anyone?
I won't tackle it, but I will offer. That goes back to, I think, Dejan's point about having these truth and reconciliation panels for the U.S. We have to. If we don't talk about the truth, if we don't make people step into that uncomfortable place, you know, we have to do it in every part of our development, from young people to adult. You're going to be uncomfortable at some point, but I think that America has to be honest about its past, its very ugly past, its free labor. And then we can get to a place of what do we do next. But if we don't talk about it, I don't think we'll ever get there positively.
And so there were the truth and reconciliation, and Ms. Linda said something about deposing our leaders. You know, like how can we do that? Like, you know,
So I'm a Howard graduate. And I was in and I was in the class that shut down the administration building the first time. And so it just really hurt me, broke my heart to see that 50 years later, from in 1968, 2018, we had another group of students closing down the administration building. I share that with you to say that the questions, the issues that came to fore were very hard for alums to accept, but we couldn't deny them, because if you had been at that school, at that institution during that 50-year period, you were sitting there nodding when you were reading some of the claims. I'm telling you that other large institutions have that same dilemma. And it's going to take some of the alumni, as my father used to say, some of the good grown people to go to them and say, yes, I benefited from my education with you, but here's what we now have to face. We can no longer do business that way. And we have some responsibility for returning or building up the assets of people that lost during the time that we were operating that way. Now, I want to say to Jenga and anybody else that's listening to this that has that question in their mind, that's a long process. The good news is that Tulane has been at this now as far as I can tell. They've been at it at least 20 years. They faced it right after Katrina when they approached some large national funders for money, and they said, well, now let's look at your history here. No, I don't think we're going to fund that because you're not serious yet about undoing racism in your institution. So I'm just saying to you, we've got to keep at it. We have to find the right leverage points, i.e. the right people who can get the attention of some of those powerful board members and the president to make the step. Now, they've made some baby steps already. You know, they apologized to Mrs. Morial for having welcomed her in as a student, and then found out she was Black and said, no, you can't come here. So they gave her an honorary degree. I mean, they did things like that, and they've done some other things. They've hired some people to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what Jenga is asking is the critical question. Mm-hmm. Now that you've done those nice things, what are you going to do for the people who lost the most? Some of whom don't even know how much they lost.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So I think it's got to be done gently, clearly, strongly, directly. And remember, the South African Truth and Reconciliation process was headed by a man of faith, Bishop Tutu. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he knew how to handle and was adroit at moving around on these. So we got to think through what that process is. We don't want everybody to end up hurt. We want a result that more people benefit from than not.
And I think also
that wisdom. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just, you know, being really thoughtful in this moment with where our national discussion is and is going around race and moving beyond an over focus on bad acts and bad actors to a much more robust understanding of institutional design and history and systems and processes and all of that. To be thoughtful about when we approach these institutions. And here in Baton Rouge, let's be clear, both Southern and LSU exist amidst some of the worst poverty and disinvestment and blight in the city. And so for any institution that sits in these communities, how do we want, you know, what is the best practice for these institutions to weigh in? Oftentimes, it's not that they haven't tried, they've just gone about it the wrong way. They've gone about it heavy-handed, or they've gone about it, not really fully committing resources or not really thinking about what's in the best interest of the community. So really, you know, holding the feet to the fire to say that we want to see a real commitment that is backed by the expenditure of resources, right? But we also want you to go about it in a way that is centering the people in this neighborhood, not as charity cases, right? But from a justice framework, that they are deserving because you understand this history, because you understand your role of bad action or inaction, right? And that these as your neighbors, as stakeholders, just as deserving as your students or administrators or your faculty. It's helping everyone reconceptualize what their role is. And I think that's a big task, because I think a lot of these institutions haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the communities that surround them, particularly when they're poor and majority Black and blighted in disinvestment, as partners, right? As people with whom they have some linked fate with, and therefore owe something, not as donor and donee, but as neighbor, as citizens, as partners. So.
Well, I'm hopeful. One of the things that I'm hopeful of in this moment of, you know, social truth telling and reckoning that we are in right now is that, you know, people will understand their links, you know, a little more directly and understand their responsibility to one another, you know, as citizens, and, you know, really seeing everyone's right to equitable citizenship. And the last comment that I don't see any other questions, but we have a comment in the chat from Ryan Paul Johnson, who says that as a young Black planning student in the Master of Urban and Regional Planning program at UNO, I'm very honored to see so many Black leaders in New Orleans fighting for topics that I strongly believe in. I definitely will be getting in touch with these great panelists, especially about collaborations between the many organizations that are represented here today and students in my program. So I would say that with such an encouragement from a young person that we have done at least part of our job. And so I'm grateful to each of you for your participation, but also, for the work that you do every single day around these realities. And, excited to be in the work with you, and also excited that ULI is seeing its role as a citizen partner in addressing these issues that are, issues that we as Black folk who live in Black community wear on our sleeve, and have not always seen the professional organizations looking to partner with us in this way. So we're excited, about the work and the outreach that ULI is doing, and, look to have your assistance in changing this narrative for our state. And as I'm done now, I have moderated.
Thank you very much. Asali, there is one more question.
Oh, okay.
It's in the Q&A little tab at the bottom.
Yeah, no, I've been looking in that. I don't see another question. The last one that I had was Jenga. Oh, could you read it for me?
Sure. It says, are there situations where city governments overestimate Black properties in New Orleans for the sake of taxes and residents not being able to keep their properties based on that?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is in the answer because he answered his own question. Hello, Mr. Seals. So I would say in my experience, and I'm going to ask Greg to speak on this, and if anybody else has any experience with it. In my experience, what we're learning is that Black properties get overestimated, meaning when a white person moves into the neighborhood, then magically the property taxes change. And so overestimation in that way, so they have been used to paying, at a kind of certain amount in rate over decades, and then the tax base of that neighborhood changes drastically, which causes folks to then be threatened, by the property taxes. So we have one of the anti-displacement measures that has worked in other places, is around attaching people's property tax to their wages. So in a place like New Orleans, where a family might have, lived in their home for 60 years, those same 60 years, they're making the same amount of money, then those people won't be impacted and, lose their home, because certainly we're not going to make the tourism and hospitality industry pay equitably, right? But that's a whole nother conversation. Greg.
I agree with you. I agree that I've seen in my role, my side inside of government, that the property assessment is used as a way we overprice it. When working in for neighborhood, and watching property values go up, and then Black folks can't afford property taxes, and the city doesn't have a policy where you can kind of put it on a little way, pay at a little time. They want it all up front, and sometimes that sticker shock went from, I paid $700 a year for property tax. Now I'm paying $1,700 in 1 year difference. When other folk moved in my neighborhood, it would change. And I think a lot of it I've seen been used around this property assessment and property tax, as getting people out. But it typically happens when displacement starts to happen and people start buying up property and shooting up the value of neighborhoods. And so that's an example in Ferret neighborhood where people were displaced because they couldn't afford the property tax, and then people couldn't buy the house from underneath them. Using city policies.
I would also mention, obviously not a New Orleans example, but there is a class action lawsuit in Detroit underway right now for the historic pattern of overassessment, particularly in Black neighborhoods. There's been a lot of activism around it, and so just offering that as a footnote, a great way to understand this issue. Look at what's going on in Detroit.
I also want to suggest that we watch this carefully, because all Black people are not poor, and there's no honor in poverty. I mean, let's face it, nobody wants to be there forever. So we want to think about strategies when we're assessing property or levying taxes that are ways that everybody can have a buy-in. I was listening to you, Asali. I thought that was a great example of how your income is affiliated, associated, with your tax level. But I really, and I'm not a tax aficionado, and I'm blessed because I have a homestead exemption. Remember, there's certain idiosyncrasies we have here
Mm-hmm.
We have to pay attention to, and that I've been advocating about for many, many years, even before I understood it well. So just note that we've got to figure out how do we not lose the quality of people that we want to be able to live with us, whether their income level is,
That's right.
socioeconomic level is what, and how do we keep ownership of the land?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of just developers are using very intentional strategies, around gentrification. And they are, using trickery to move the needle on the value of properties, in neighborhoods, that are historically where the land is very valuable, but there are people of color that live in those neighborhoods. So I do love that idea that you brought out, Asali, and I just think there should be a way as you start to see quickly and aggressively property values start to move up because of gentrification, that there should be a way to grandfather some of those, families that have been vested in these communities over all these years, and now they're seeing that their property values are in just a few years, doubling and tripling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So there are yeah, their policy link actually has a lot of strategies that they've collected from around the country. Nobody has in place, which is where I think New Orleans could really distinguish itself, and be a model and leader in this place. So there are lots of different strategies around anti-displacement, but there's not an entire comprehensive policy that's in place anywhere. And so that's the kind of thing, particularly, with the City Hall moving into the historically Black neighborhood of America, right? The first place where Black people were able to buy their own homes, right? And City Hall is now moving there. What is that going to mean for that community without some intentionality in place around protecting folks' right to stay there? In the answer, I saw it was there, but it disappeared. Someone asked about the book. It's Know Your Price, PRICE, and it is by Andre Perry at the Brookings Institute.
Asali, I wanted to just add this one thing to the conversation because it's been beautiful, and I just don't want to miss this opportunity just to say that we also need to be thinking about collective ownership beyond land trusts. Like land trusts are a great model, and also thinking about models like in DC where they're limited equity cooperatives where, if a collective of people decide, hey, we want to live together, we want to be in community, we have to start to give people multiple options to say, actually, the history of like rugged individualism, or like, I think about my parents and grandparents who worked, 2 and 3 jobs and like barely get to spend time in their home, who like, what if they had the option to co-own and share in the equity and the maintenance of a place that allowed them to actually enjoy their home? That isn't just subsidy and affordable housing or land trust. So just offering that as an opportunity to say, if we aren't thinking about our future collectively and having a shared ownership model, then we could potentially end up in the same place that we've been in.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those ideas, Dejan. There are a couple of other questions that I think that even speaks to inside of here. So one is from Allison Hartling. I just wrote my thesis to finish grad school in the urban and regional planning program at UNO on inequitable property tax system in Southeast Louisiana, as well as in coastal gentrification, and have become more interested in the policy side of housing issues as opposed to planning. Any advice on how to get involved in policy legislation on these issues? And then the second question is, what are some examples of gentrification trickery that citizens can look out for from land developers? So I say to anybody that's looking to get involved in the housing policy stuff to reach out to Housing NOLA and Andronika Morris. I don't think there's anyone, more Well, the rain is coming. There's not anyone more educated around those issues, and even if she's, you know, not the place for you to be, she can point you in the right direction. And so, and I'm gonna open it up to the panelists to give some examples of gentrification trickery. But I'm even thinking that that could be like a little book, a brochure, like we can collect a bunch of, you know, in some kind of publication out to people. Just an idea. Thank you for that gentrification trickery question.
I'll offer up. I've seen where developers go into a neighborhood, you know, they get a house that they've gotten for a small amount of money, they make it nice, and then they sell to somebody who's working with them for a cash sale for a very high amount. So when the next property they develop, they've got a comp now, and an income where other properties are not valuing that high, but now they have a comparable property to say, we just sold this property, you know, for some exorbitant amount of money, but they're working together. And then you do the next one the same thing, and then before you know it, you've got 2 or 3 comps where the, you know, where the property value is much, much higher, and then you've got those people who've been invested in those communities for years. Property values in that area now are going up, you know, to a place where they probably can't afford their property taxes. And that's how they start to move up, you know, and gentrify your neighborhoods. And then people will, you know, end up being displaced and not being able to afford property in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, and we experienced something one time with a community garden that we had in Tremay. Now, we'd had this garden for maybe about 15 years, and then somebody came and put a lien against like the previous property owner, like and who was dead, you know, had died years ago. And so we found out in that case that folks were putting you know, putting liens on people's property, you know, from like, you know, saying it's an old debt, and the folks are, you know, dead, and they might be, you know, with their heirs, but, you know, don't have the, you know, they haven't done like the actual succession stuff, and they are able to get the properties in that way. I mean, like in this company who said that, you know, it was a debt from 1980 something, this company didn't even come into existence until 2002. So, yeah. Anyone else has any gentrification trickery messages?
Well, I would just say, not necessarily a trickery story, but it is, you know, we have to build resources to educate people on the particularities of Louisiana law when it comes to title and transfer. That is where I think a lot of our families, through the failure to have successions, through, you know, kind of the collective action problems that kind of end up down a bloodline when you get property tied up, and on the neighborhood side, what those collective action problems on a piece of property due to a neighborhood, you know, where you can't get people to care enough because there's simply not enough value in their mind for them to care. The legal hurdles are too difficult, or you can't locate people because they're too far down the bloodline and don't even know they have this interest. Something we have a lot of. I mean, obviously it's a state problem, it's a Louisiana law problem, but it's something we see in Baton Rouge, and to Sally's point, something that I think Housing NOLA and its focus on policy, not just in New Orleans, but statewide around housing, and its organizing around housing statewide is really focused on. And we recently, last year, had a convening on that, and I think there'll be more. So.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that after Katrina, you know, where those properties hadn't gone through proper succession, and then people were not able to negotiate, you know, the homes because they weren't the owners.
Yeah.
Do we have in Orleans Parish, I'll start there, but do we have a lot of heirs property? Does anybody know?
So you mean heirs property, meaning that stuff that the city has is kind of
No, somebody, it's a property that maybe, let's say, my great grandmother had, and she died, and my grandmother got it, and she lived there, and then but we don't have the paperwork that says that the great grandmother owned the property. So that, so do we have a lot of that in
We do. And there's an organization here called Johnny Appleseed that helps people to work through that succession legal work.
I know in South Carolina, they have a great project on heirs property, and they have brochures and everything, because not only were there people who didn't have paperwork, there were families who owned property, and so many of them had pieces of it.
Yeah.
And they were not willing to sell, or if they sold, then they lost property. Black people lost property and land. Okay.
And the challenge is, you know, we are a extremely property rights focused state. And so where there have been attempts to address the issue of heirs property in the legislature, and some of these have been fairly recent, you actually find, you know, strange bedfellows on the left and the right of right? And a lot of us, particularly in Black communities, and I have this in my family, right? Don't let go of the property. So whatever you do, don't let go of the property. Well, that doesn't always involve doing the successions and making sure that the title work is current on the property, so that you know who's paying taxes. And if one person is stuck paying taxes and feel that they can't uphold that burden, or they shouldn't, it's unfair, then these, you know, that property goes into adjudication. It sits, you know, and you got to figure out what to do with it. And there are all these other downstream issues. So just having, you know, I think it goes back to education, right? How do we help people understand the Louisiana's legal regime, and not just so you can understand it to, you know, act accordingly, but also what opportunities for law reform are there, and how do we think about that? Not just, you know, we think that just in terms of the individual property owner, not the collective impacts of property ownership on a community. So.
Excellent. Well, you know, I will sit and talk to y'all forever, but I told my children I needed an hour and a half, and I'm starting to hear them on the other side of the door. And I'm sure everyone else is having the rest of their life to come to bear at this moment. But I'm extremely grateful for having had this conversation, and excited to see what other conversations come out of this larger one. I already, you know, as my grandpa used to say, I smell the wood burning, you know, the ideas and the collaborations and all of that stuff. So I want to give a great thanks to Nicole and Jean for convening us and to opening this conversation up to their larger constituency.
Thank you very much. A big thanks to Asali and Nairi for putting this together. You know, obviously you ran this event, and it's really wonderful. And on behalf of ULI Louisiana, I look forward to working with you guys some more and continue the conversation. You know, so this was really, really great. And also, you know, for all those in Southwest Louisiana and Texas who's going through the hurricane that's coming through right now, you know, our love and support for you guys also. Thanks for watching.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.